Hey everybody, it's Dan. I have another one of my games I wanted to share with you all. I was recently able to find a steady partner to meet and play with almost weekly. The games are very informal, and while we are evenly matched, the games aren't tournament level in their skill by any means. Still, we've met about 5 times, and we usually play 3 to 4 games each time we meet, with 15-minute time controls and a 10-second increment. And what I'd ideally like to do is look at one game from each meetup and post that. In this particular game, my opponent was playing white and I was playing black. I employed the French defense to come out with the win, but I have lost to him plenty as well, and I definitely want to look at those games soon too. But for this particular game, as I said, we got into the French, more specifically the Winawer variation. Now, I haven't looked at this variation very closely yet. I made a video on the advanced variation of the French, but there are several other popular variations as well, and the Winawer is one of them. One of the common features of the Winawer is that black will almost always give up the dark square bishop very early in the game in order to inflict structural damage in white's pawn structure on the queen side. So once I bring out the bishop, my opponent decided to immediately resolve the tension in the center, another common feature of the Winawer, gaining space and slightly cramping my king side development by taking away f6 from my knight. Now here I played knight to c6, but this actually turns out not to be the best move in the position. The book line actually continues with c5 immediately, and this just makes sense. In the advanced variation I looked at a while back, as well as in the Tarrasch variation which I've looked into but haven't made a video about yet, c5 is played prior to the knight coming out. The French is a hyper-modern defense, meaning black is going to cede the center to white in the first couple of moves only to immediately put pressure on it, and c5 does just that. From here the book continues with a3 to stimulate the exchange, and then we end up in this position right here. However, again, that's not what was played. Instead, what I went with was an immediate knight to c6. My opponent still put the question to my bishop, and I capture. After the recapture, I develop my knight to the only other logical square, e7, with an idea to get to f5 ASAP to start building up the pressure on d4. My opponent pushes a4 first, and I immediately stop that pawn from going any further. Next, he played queen to g4, putting pressure on the unprotected g7 pawn, but now knight to f5, the move I wanted to play anyway, conveniently defends. And what else is great is that with the queen on g4, there will not be a pawn push anytime soon to kick my knight away. From here, my opponent played bishop to b5, attacking my knight. I defend with bishop to d7, breaking the pin, and here my opponent played an interesting move which has its pluses and minuses. He captured my knight, and I recaptured with the bishop. Now the plus is that the knight was putting a lot of pressure on d4, and white has succeeded in alleviating that pressure a little bit. But there are several downsides to bishop captures on c6. One, in the French defense, the universal drawback of the defense is that black's light square bishop has a notoriously difficult time getting into the game. But with the recapture, my bishop, while not in the most active position, is developed and is supporting my center and my queen side quite nicely. The second major disadvantage of this exchange for my opponent is that the light square bishop was his good bishop, since his pawns in the center are fixed on dark squares. So he's now traded off his good bishop for what was probably for me just an okay knight. In hindsight, I don't think this was the right thing for my opponent to do. Nonetheless, that is what was played, and so we wound up in this position here. Now my opponent plays bishop to a3, which is quite annoying because it prevents me from castling. However, this is a small blunder because it drops the a4 pawn, which I take right away. In doing so, I'm also attacking c2, and white played an interesting move and went king to d2 to defend. But I actually think here queen to e2 would have been better, since it not only defends, but is clearing the way for an eventual g4 to attack my knight and kick it out of its very central post. Not that g4 would have been played right away, not that it would have been best, but it is definitely a possibility at an opportune moment. But again, that's not what was played. Instead, my opponent went with the king move to d2 here. And here I played a move that, in hindsight, I think was just a waste of time. I played my bishop back to c6. I didn't like my bishop being loose on a4, so I brought it back to its solid post on c6. But looking at this now, I can see that there really is no reason in this position to retreat voluntarily. Sure, the bishop on a3 could move with a discovered attack on my bishop, but that's not really a viable tactic for my opponent at the moment, whereas my bishop is putting pressure on the queen side. I think instead a better move would have been an expansion on the king side with h5, kicking the queen around a little bit. Let's say after h5 you have queen to f4, I could follow up with g5, and after queen f3 we have knight h4, and here if the queen plays to g3, well, that's just a sad position for her to be in, and if in this position we have queen to f6, After the exchange, the knight picks up the g2 pawn, and black is in very pretty here. So basically, just to go back to this position right here, I had the initiative, and I let it slip away by playing overly cautiously. So after I retreat the bishop here, white develops the knight. I attack the queen with h5, and my opponent offers a queen exchange, which was probably the best move. After the exchange, however, we can see that white's knight is in a great position, and it won't be so easy to shoo it away from g5. That's why I think actually a better move in this position right here would have been maybe something like pawn to h6, guarding the g5 square. But again, that's not what was played, and we wound up in this position right here. And then after the recapture, here I actually played a small blunder. I pushed f6, wanting to get the knight out of my territory. This, however, drops the e-pawn. My opponent decides first to capture on f6, and then he takes on e6. Now, this is, of course, threatening the fork on c7, so I just avoid that check with moving my king to d7. White hits a check on c5, and I move king to c8. And here my opponent makes just a bad move. Looking at it now, I can see what the move is intended to do. He plays g3, which is preemptively protecting the g-pawn, which is on an open file, and will probably come under some pressure at some point from one of my rooks. The problem is, this is way too passive. Whereas I kind of gave up the initiative before with the bishop retreat from the queen side, here white should be playing in the center, activating their rooks, or even planting the knight back on c6. Instead, g3 does nothing to help white's position, and in fact gives me an opening, which I take to grab control for the rest of the game. I start by moving knight to d6, which is of course eyeing the e4 square. My opponent puts the rook on the open e-file, but here I just kick his knight away with c5, and then I plant my knight on e4 with check. What's more, this check is winning me a pawn, since my knight is forking the king and the pawns on f2 and c3. My opponent retreats to c1, and here I decided to take on f2 since the c-pawns are doubled and I don't want to eliminate that weakness in the position if I don't have to. But after I take the pawn, my opponent played a move that I just don't understand. Here he just sacks the knight on c7. I think he was probably hoping to get some counterplay on the open file, because he does hit a check right away, but I just block with my bishop, and now I'm not only up a piece, but finally my rooks are connected, which I haven't been able to do all game. Here, white moves the king out of the way to bring the other rook over, and I challenge the rook on e7 right away. White now tries to bring his other rook into the action so that if I capture, he can recapture and still have a rook on the 7th. But I don't recapture. Instead, I just sever the connection between the rooks with knight to e4, and there's absolutely no way to move that knight. It's sitting pretty on a central square, and it is there to stay. So after this, my opponent played one more move here, and then in this position, he resigned. So that was the game. As was obvious from the play, neither of us are exactly top-notch players, but we are very passionate about the game for sure, and I hope, as always, to learn something not only from my own mistakes, but from my opponents as well. One thing I'll say is that it's really easy to recite the principles of chess. Don't move a piece more than once in the opening, don't give up the initiative, attack when you have the chance, etc. But in practice, actually acting on these principles is tough. It's very easy to miss something, especially when you're playing relatively quick games, such as the 15-minute time controls that my opponent and I always use. What I got out of this game was to recognize certain positions for their strengths and weaknesses. For example, my bishop on a4, which was a better position than I realized, or playing h5, which prompted the queen exchange and led to white's knight in my territory. Besides just not making simple mistakes like dropping pawns and whatnot, I'm also working on analyzing the positions that actually come up in my games, so I can recognize my advantages and capitalize on them, or my weaknesses and defend against those. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. I think that actually, sadly, this is going to be my last video for the next few months. As I've mentioned in previous videos, I'm in grad school, and my semester is starting up in just a couple of days, and I have a lot of preparation for that yet. And making videos during the semester is nearly impossible with all the work I have. If I'm lucky, I'll be able to make and post 1 or 2 videos during the semester. Otherwise, I think on my winter break is when I'm actually going to get the next chance. As for this video, questions and comments on the positions that came up are certainly welcome. I especially enjoy getting comments about my own games because, as you can see, I have a lot of room for improvement. Ratings are also appreciated, and with that, just thanks for watching and take care.